that I'd become any sort of an expert on anything having to do with energy, but the events of this past spring proved otherwise. I think that the energy crisis, while the people in the know and the experts certainly saw things coming, were obviously doing things behind the scenes, there were many human faces who had absolutely no idea what the challenges were going to be. We're going to hear from some different facets today on the human face and what the crisis meant to people personally, what it meant to nonprofit organizations, what it means to the everyday consumer. I want to share just a little bit about what we went through, the California Association of Health Facilities, this past spring. The Hospital Association, early on and before we were even aware of it, the California Association of Health Facilities represents long-term care, nursing homes, and homes for the developmentally disabled. And the Hospital Association had applied for and was granted an exemption from blackouts, and we suddenly got on the bandwagon and realized that we too. The mics are for the television. I'll try to speak up. So in April, on behalf of our 1,300 members, we applied to the Public Utilities Commission, as they directed us to, and asked that all of our facilities be exempted. We also asked the utilities in the state whether or not it was possible to exempt nursing homes, many of which, as you know, are in residential communities, and if you exempt a nursing home, you're exempting an awful lot of other buildings in that neighborhood. So we expected that there would be a decision in May on our 1,200, 1,300 building exemption request, and instead the PUC was inundated with so many requests for exemptions that they developed another category, a catch-all category, and said that anyone who wanted to apply for a specific exemption would have to do so online through the PUC website. Well, as you can imagine, a lot of nursing homes are not really high-tech. A lot of them are not on the web. A lot of them don't have access, and so we as an association applied again for a blanket exemption. We were told that wasn't possible, that every facility had to file an online application, and they were only given about 5 days to do so. So in the end, only about 200 facilities did apply for the exemption, and there was an aspect in the exemption paperwork. It was a 9-page application. The first thing that was problematic right off the get-go was they had to submit their original utility bill from August of the previous year. Most of them didn't have it, so that was one thing. And then there was a section which we certainly understood why the PUC needed this section, but it said, please outline for us in detail what the health and safety risks to your population would be. Well, liability is an enormous issue for any healthcare provider, and many of our facilities were very reluctant, as one can understand, to say we have people on respirators, ventilators, IVs, electric beds, and what have you, dialysis equipment, and if our power goes out, people may die. That's not something that our facilities wanted to publicize. So in the end, there were about 88 facilities that the consultant to the PUC said merited being exempted, and those 88, as I understand, have been exempted, and the others, because they were concerned about liability, were rather sketchy on what they thought that what they felt that they should put down on the application. But the PUC consultants, and we think rightly, did suggest to the PUC that we figure out a way to exempt all these facilities, at least certainly the facilities that are known as subacute or high acuity facilities who have the truly medically needy. I mean, we're talking about 140,000 frail and elderly in nursing homes on any given day in California. And even if they're not respirator dependent or oxygen dependent or something like that, there's the air conditioning to think about, the heating systems to think about, food refrigeration, nursing homes do have to have generators, but the generators are required only to provide some emergency lighting, the call bells, the telephone system, and the fire system. Certainly not enough to run the high-tech medical equipment that so many of our residents need. So it's been truly a learning experience. It's been an interesting experience. We are so grateful that we kind of got this period of time as a trial run. We've all learned. We now will continue to work with the PUC, which we've developed a wonderful relationship with, and figure out now where do we go from here before we perhaps have another one. So I think we're all grateful that we dodged the bullet this summer with rather mild temperatures. But I have to say that there was an awful lot of angst among our members and among specific residents in our facilities. We did news conferences from Reading to San Diego on the issue, and I've brought just a few of the press clips from it. And there are many residents who really, confused or not confused, were very, very concerned as to whether or not they were going to be without power. And that doesn't even speak to some of the other issues that are going to come up about the utility costs. I mean, nursing homes are financially strapped like never before, and we had facilities report 50% and in some cases up to 150% increases in their electric bills. So it was an enormous problem for a population who has never had, and most of us, I think, frankly, have never had to think about the availability of power. It's always been there, it's always going to be there, and it's reasonably priced. So this was a wake-up for a lot of different folks, and I think that it will, prove to be something we can take a look at down the road. Before I turn this over to others, I wanted to pass on one interesting thing. When the PUC announced that they were going to do this new catch-all category and everyone had to apply individually, there was an article in the Chronicle that kind of illustrated some of the goofiness of this system of, literally tens of thousands of entities filing online applications for exemptions. And I'm quoted in the same paragraph in an article talking about respirators, ventilators, and high acuity patients as a guy from a place called the Mad Dog Tattoo Parlor in Westminster, California. And he said, nursing homes think they've got problems. If we're in the middle of a genital piercing and the lights go out, that could be problematic. So my staff thought it was pretty funny when me and the guy from Mad Dog Tattoo were teaming up to get an exemption. My other favorite one was one of the ball clubs. Was quoted, they said it would be very serious if they were exempted, or if they were not exempted, and the reporter asked, because people wouldn't be able to evacuate, the escalators would be, and he said, no, because the ATMs wouldn't work and we'd have to do all cash beer sales. So, I don't know, I think the respirators and the ventilators are a little more important than the all-cash beer sales, but that's just one person's opinion. But I think that it's really afforded us an opportunity to look as a profession and as an entity that's largely been overlooked with regard to the exemption. I think the PUC has certainly learned an awful lot about nursing homes and about the acuity and the level of care that we provide, and I have no doubt that we're going to be able to come up with some sort of a practical solution. Hopefully we won't go through this again, but if we do, hopefully we'll be able to make sure that we can protect the lives of 140,000 very frail and elderly people. With that, we've been told that we need to leave as much time possible for questions, so I'm going to turn the program over to Ken Larson, who is the Director of Public Policy for the California Association of Nonprofits.
Great, thanks. I've been with the California Association of Nonprofits for the last couple of months, and prior to that was with the Friends Committee on Legislation, which was involved in a number of issues around low-income people and energy. So I'd like to pass out this little checklist I developed earlier this year, and I'll keep one for myself. And I want to tell you the stories of three people who were very much affected by the energy crisis. And they're not real people, they're sort of composites, but I think they illustrate some points that appear on this checklist. And we'll call one of them Steve. And Steve was the operator, the guy who sits at the controls of a power plant in Pittsburgh that I was able to visit this spring on a tour with the Assembly Utilities Committee. And I learned from Steve and from some of the other workers there, first, how proud they were, that they were in the center and getting recognition for the first time in their lives for the important work that they did. And at the same time, they were very frustrated. The crisis was being blamed at that time on plant shutdowns. Some of them said they were afraid to go to parties because people would grab them and yell at them and say, "You caused this problem for us. You know, you guys are screwing up." And it was, sadly, it was a little bit reinforced by one of the legislators who was there, because it turned out that although he was the operator of this plant, he didn't have a college degree, and he had operated the power plant on a nuclear sub for 7 or 8 years before that, and he was very proud of it. But the legislator kept saying, "Well, don't you have a degree, PhD, graduate work, and so on?" It was clear this was one of the most efficient plants in the state, but he was sort of struggling with both the sense that he wasn't trained enough and that he was to blame for this problem. So that's one human face. I'm sort of taking this literally. The other human face is a guy we'll call Armando. And this is where you can sort of start looking down the checklist and seeing how he was affected. He's a guy who is sort of marginally employed in casual labor just outside of Sacramento. He sometimes works in retail. He sometimes does odd jobs around farms and processing plants. He's also a guy who was a Vietnam veteran, a little bit crazy, somewhat disabled, getting some disability funding, sort of in the underground economy to make sure that he keeps his disability, and very, very anxious as a result of the crisis, and for good reason. And Betsy sort of alluded to some of the issues around the groups that she works with and losing power, and this was also true for some of the small farm operations that he worked with. Dairies, where he did casual labor, depended on steady power supply to keep milk at a marketable temperature and to run the equipment to milk the cows and to light the barns. Processing plants that he worked in sometimes, if you shut down a cannery for a period of time, you're going to lose the whole product. You know, a lot of this didn't develop, but in February, this was a cause for great anxiety. He worked sometimes in a greenhouse, and greenhouses also were very dependent on a steady supply of electricity to maintain their temperature. Restaurants, same problem. Got to keep food cold, got to cook it. Can't do it, have to lay people off. Can't keep the place open and meet public health standards. He also had his mother lived down. I'm trying to remember. Was it Bell Gardens? Was the city where they had a referendum on the power plant? Does anybody remember? I think so. Anyway, there was a city in Southern California that was made up mostly of Latino folks, low-income people, and they were so concerned about the siting of a new power plant in their community that they actually either had a referendum or a city council race that was based around this single issue. His mother lived within a block of where the plant was supposed to be located. She suffered from emphysema and was just basically frail and very, very concerned about the effect of any kind of air pollution that was going to be created by this plant. So let's go on to the next person. But I think you can see for Armando, the energy crisis was not simply a small issue. It was literally a life and death issue for his mother. It was certainly an economic survival issue for him. The third person we'll talk about I'll call Emma, and she runs a small nonprofit program for homeless people, providing them with food, temporary shelter, and the like. And she was very, very concerned in the spring because, again, the interruptions in power supply for a program like hers would mean that she'd have people who were already kind of, in many cases, marginal psychologically, subjected to greater stress, the lights going out, food not being available when they expected it, and not having anywhere else to go. As you know, for example, in Sacramento, many people walk out to Loaves and Fishes from downtown Sacramento. It's about a mile walk, I'd say. If they go out there and expect to be fed and aren't, they literally may not have the wherewithal to go somewhere else. They may not have the energy to do it if they're unhealthy, and they may just not know where else to go. But she's even more concerned now because, as you know, the state budget is somewhat in jeopardy for the coming year, depending on who you talk to. The state treasurer says that there could be as much as a $9 billion deficit if the bonds that he wants to sell are not sold. If that's the case, then there's going to have to be cutbacks somewhere. And as we've found over the years, typically those cutbacks take place in the health and human services arena. So currently, Emma is very, very concerned, having sort of weathered the first phase of the crisis, which was literally a power crisis, now into more of a policy crisis that revolves around the state budget and the billions of dollars that have been expended by the state to buy power. We don't know where this is going to go, and I'll leave that to other folks in the room who I think are probably better policy wonks than I am to give us some sense about that. But the power crisis has really evolved into a policy crisis, and I fear that next year we're going to be talking about this subject again, but it's going to be about where does the state get the dollars to provide services? Where do local governments get the money to provide the services that they're not getting from the state? And just as a final note, this is getting into the policy area and something that's been overlooked, but reported a little in the press. Many cities, and I'm trying to remember, there were a couple in Orange County, I think, that had large investments in PG&E. And I know that some of them were going to suffer losses in the hundreds of millions of dollars as a result of the bankruptcy of PG&E. So this is something that I've tried to portray the personal level, but it has immense policy implications, not just in state government, but also locally. So I'll turn it over to our next speaker.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to introduce Nettie Hoag, Executive Director of the Utility Reform Network, frequently quoted in the press, representing TURN.
Thank you. I thought I'd just introduce myself by saying a little bit about what TURN is and what we do. TURN is a nonprofit, belongs to CAN. We have been around for 28 years, and the mission of the organization is to advocate on behalf of small ratepayers. That would be residential and small business customers of the major utilities. That would be gas, electricity, and telephone services. I've been there for close to 7 years, but I have to say that the entire time that I was there, we have always been sort of used to sort of struggling along in relative just unknown kind of, everybody talks about what we do is like it's the most boring thing in the world, and arcane and rate structures and utilities. And I have to say, just by introduction, the most shocking thing that has happened over the last 18 months is all of a sudden having this issue area be the most highly covered area in the papers every single day. And I get used to, and I've gotten used to the notion of, well, I have some things to say, but they're really boring, and rates are going to go up, we're fighting at the PUC, and I would be places where people would accost me and sit me down and say, tell me what's going on, tell me what your analysis is, what's really happening. And I'd start to talk and realize people were way ahead of the curve. They knew more about the issues in some instances than I did, because the press has been on this issue with such incredible focus and has done slices of the issue that even TURN wasn't focused on or aware of. And so suddenly this issue exploded, and it wasn't just how much do you pay on your bills, it's what are our priorities about environmental considerations, what plants are we going to cite, where, when, why, how do we regulate, what is market power, does the loss of regulation have a direct relationship to the crisis we experienced. So it all of a sudden became a very fascinating and very heady interest area. So that when I talk about and think about the faces, I mostly have thought about our constituency as sort of a large group of people, and we don't get a lot of individuals who come up to us and say, I'm having trouble. That has happened this year because of the extremes. But I think more in terms of what are the economic impacts of this catastrophe sort of in the broad picture. If you're a householder and suddenly one of your major costs escalates, that's not a trivial thing. It impacts everything that you do in your life. It impacts how you expend your expendable income, if you have any. In some cases, we had people talking about, basically freezing in the dark because it took a long time for the media to catch on to the winter crisis, which was not so much about electricity, especially in Northern California, where rates were frozen, but was more about the price of our major fuel for heating and cooking, natural gas. And while the press was focused on the electricity crisis, all of our constituents were yelling and screaming about how they could not afford to pay their gas bill. And we had a lot of major negotiations about shut-off, and there were nonprofits in local communities trying to raise money for local folks who were on fixed incomes who just could not afford to keep the utilities on. And you'd hear these horrible stories about months and months of non-payment. And of course the utility was making it seem like, these are not simple issues, right? There's always a deadbeat behind every unpaid bill. But in reality, people would just fall behind. They'd fall behind a little bit, and then a lot more, and then a lot more, and it was harder and harder to pay the bill until we were seeing shutoffs. So that has been a major impact on people's lives. Once again, looking at it from sort of a macro position, I think the impact that this has on the economy is profound and will be profound. We started out talking about blackouts, and our major focus and concern coming into the summer was, would we be able to keep the lights on? Well, we did, and so the crisis changed from an immediate crisis to a sustained, chronic, long-term crisis. We've got rates that are still way, way above where they were. When we came out of deregulation after the legislation in 1996, rates were frozen for residential and small commercial customers. And we were promised that we would see rates go down by 20% by the end of the transition period. In fact, rates have escalated, close to 40%. Small businesses and medium-sized businesses are going to find that doing business in California is not incredibly competitive given these huge rates, and that's going to have economic dislocation, which will trickle down to every employee. What happened? We started out where I would say the major difficulty and problem with California was the divestiture of utility-operated plants to the free market. The theory was that in the generation component of electricity, we would create competition and allow many suppliers to provide electricity. The large customers were salivating over this. When electricity deregulation first occurred, the large industrial users were pushing this. We were coming out of a recession in California. The notion was, for really big users, this was a large fixed component of their bills. If we could get those bills down, those enterprises could be more competitive. Naively, folks saw spot market prices around the country, partly because of natural gas prices being low, and thought, well, why is the utility price so high? Let's get that price. So they went after that price in deregulation. Following on that was the notion, well, what about small customers who are captive customers? So the legislature said, well, you can go out and shop too, which was a complete farce, because I don't know how many of you come home from a busy day, make dinner, take care of all of your family's needs, and then say, time to shop for electricity. I want the best electrons, the greenest and the cheapest. It doesn't happen. I mean, it didn't work from a sort of psychological perspective. The market wasn't there, but for other reasons, the market wasn't there. So the utilities were able to sell off their plants to the quote-unquote competitors. The idea that there would be competition flourishing would bring rates down. What happened instead is amazing market power was exercised, and so prices on the spot market skyrocketed, and we were in a position where utilities were buying largely on the spot market for a million reasons that we can talk about, but I really do want to be careful about the time constraints. And then the prices in San Diego doubled and tripled, and that was the beginning in May, the year before this last May, of the crisis as we knew it. And then we were warning, it's coming here, folks, because the rate freeze is off. We had a rate freeze. We fought over whether it was sustainable to keep rates frozen while the utilities were paying these large wholesale market prices. And the rates increased. The commission immediately went into session. December added a penny a kilowatt hour, and then later on a 3-cent charge. In January, the governor went into emergency session, declared an emergency, and got the state into the power buying business. And now that the state is in the power buying business, we've spent billions of dollars, more than we would have spent otherwise. The state treasurer, as you know, is trying to get bonds issued that will have major implications on whether we have a deficit and what the health of the general fund is in an economic down cycle. However, what you have to think about, I believe, when you think about the faces of this crisis, and this is where I began, is that each of those billions of dollars that the state utilities and individuals have put forward to purchase power above and beyond what we were paying for before the beginning of the crisis, they all are taking away from opportunity elsewhere. And if we make it through, we keep the lights on, we still must remember the foregone economic opportunity for health services, for state services, for those things that the general fund will pay for, and in addition to that, for the kinds of consumer spending or small business growth and development, economic investment that will not happen. I mean, we can borrow money, folks, but when we borrow money, we pay interest. So the governor, the treasurer, and our legislators have been scrambling as fast as they can to mitigate the damages that this crisis has produced. And we are mitigating the damages, but we cannot avoid them. They will have long-term implications for our economy for the next 2 decades. And, everyone's working as hard as they can to avoid the worst of those. The other thing I just wanted to touch on is, as an impact and on the face of California, what the crisis has had is an impact on how we regulate, what the philosophy about regulation is and what the future of regulation is. And I think that it's also put in very, very high contrast or stark relief what are the shortcomings of several of our systems of governance. I think that we've seen things fraying around the edges because of term limits. I believe that the expertise and the commitment of our legislature is not at the same caliber it would have been or could have been or should have been. And for all the amazing work that leadership has done, the body politic, the legislature, the Assembly and the Senate did not function efficiently and effectively as you would want a governance structure, a legislative body, to function. And we saw incredible fights between the houses, and it was alarming and I think dispiriting to see part of what occurred in terms of not being able to solve problems. Also, we have politicized the issue of power in a way that it never has been before. So there's a lot of critical focus on the administration, on the governor, from their handling of this crisis. And while I might stand up and be one of largest critics, to see our legislature split along partisan lines, with one party simply saying, I'm not voting for anything because I'm going to get you in the next election, was indeed dispiriting. So one party had to jump forward and, take on the solution because they were in the limelight at that time. I'm not saying it might not have been reversed partisanly if it had been the other way, but regulation has been effective for 100 years, and now we've seen its demise, and I believe, and this will be my last point, I promise.
It's okay.
That as you see the work out of these utilities, what happens to bring them back to solvency, we will see what the future of public regulation of essential commodities is going to be, and I think the biggest sort of exclamation mark on the horizon at this moment is the bankruptcy workout plan proposed by our major Northern California utility, which includes a basic plan to make sure that the essential assets are divested from public oversight and given to the private market to be dealt with in the same way that the private market dealt with us during the last year. That, I think, is a very dangerous precedent. We'll see what happens, but that is the direction that things seem to be going. And before I start on a soapbox, I'll concede my space, and we can talk about this more in the discussion.
Thank you, Nettie. Okay, next up, Steve Weissman is the Senior Energy Consultant with the California PUC in San Francisco.
Thank you. Well, my goodness, we've covered a tremendous amount of territory so far in this discussion, and I kind of volunteered to be in a wrap-up position so I could see where there were things to fill in and where there weren't. I want to start by asking Nettie if I can sign at the bottom of that statement. There's nothing that Nettie said that I think was in any way inaccurate, and I think that Betsy and Ken, you both described some of the real-life impacts. Being at the PUC doesn't put me in a position to be an expert on the human face. We're a large, abstract organization that puts rules in place and then watches things either work or not work. And I think that the PUC, or at least prior members of the PUC, were very instrumental in shaping the restructured electric markets that have caused us to be here together today to talk about this. Fundamentally, I would think that the elements that make up the forces at play on human beings in a crisis like this are fairly simple. They have to do with cost and they have to do with supply, and I think we've heard descriptions of some of the general challenges that people have faced. I would really love to close the door and make you sit here and listen to me talk for a couple of hours about how we got into this mess and how we might want to get out of it. And we could probably maybe talk about some of that in the conversation portion of this meeting. But I think that what I might want to do now is just touch on a couple of nuts and bolts issues about price and about keeping the power running, and then we can take it from there. In terms of price, the legislature and the commission teamed up to try to protect small consumers in terms of direct price impacts. And what the legislature said was, Commission, we've previously created something called baseline, and this is a process under which the commission is supposed to identify an amount that equals about 50 or 60% of average usage for residential customers, and to apply the lowest cost rates to those quantities. We've told you to create baseline quantities before, Commission. Now we want you to add 30% on top of that, and we want the rates that were in effect prior to the crisis to, in effect, stay at those levels for those customers. Now, what that means, if using rough math, if the baseline is 50 or 60% of what an average customer would use, and you add 30% on top of that, that's basically telling customers that if you can keep your usage within 75 or 80% of average, you're going to see no increase in your utility bills because you'll be paying the old rates. That's roughly true, although there was a surcharge of a penny that was thrown on top of that, but it's roughly true. And so the customers at the lowest end of usage have actually not seen any direct effect on their bills. Now, multi-person households, if you got a low-income household with 7 or 8 people in it, you may be nowhere close to 80% of average, and you may actually be seeing significant increases in your bills. But the Commission had a lot of money to make up that couldn't be captured from those lower-end residential customers. So what did it do? First, it said for the residential customers who use more, the rates are going to be tiered, and those higher tiers are going to be dramatically more expensive than the lower tiers. So the more you use, the more you're going to pay. And then it went to the small commercial, the industrial customers, and hit them over the head with a 2x4 in terms of giving them enormous rate increases. And we're just now starting to see what effect that's having. And I have to say that the jury's going to be out for several months. As many of you probably have heard, we had a phenomenally lucky summer from the perspective of energy consumption. Lucky in that the temperatures were mild. Lucky in that the public responded in a very affirmative and constructive way to the calls for energy conservation. And then the most perverse form of luck has been that the economy has been suppressed and is continuing to slacken off. And for all of these reasons, the level of consumption has been down, so that that businesses are probably not seeing bills that are going to reflect what might be typical usage and typical cost once the economy is thriving again, and once we're in perhaps a more typical type of summer weathered pattern. And so I think that those consumers are going to see dramatic increases in their bills if they haven't seen them already. And of course that gets to the indirect economic impact on all of the rest of us, because as I think Ken so very clearly laid out with his examples, it's the people who are not going to be able to work those extra shifts at the restaurant because the restaurant decides to close down for lunch to keep its bills down. And it's the people who are going to be laid off in the production sector. There are many production processes for which electricity is the largest cost component, and it's now going to be significantly higher. And you go across the board through the economy, and that's where you're going to be seeing that ripple effect. And it's going to be reducing income for a lot of people if all of these other factors fall into place. Well, that's what's going on the cost side. On the supply side, we all became familiar in the last year with this phenomena of rolling blackouts that we've frankly never had to face before. I guess first the question is, why are we having rolling blackouts? And without getting into the deep-seated psychological issues that affected the way supply was made available in the market, very simply, those who operate the electric system have to ensure that there's not only enough power being supplied to meet all the current demand, but that there is a cushion. There's got to be at least a small cushion to protect the system against a sudden loss. If one of the power plants were to suddenly go down, and if the margin of extra power available was very thin, then you've got the possibility that you may have people drawing more power off the system than the system is producing. If that happens, you can have a sudden and in many ways devastating reaction with the entire system crashing. Now when that occurs, it can take many days, sometimes weeks, to find all of the damage that occurred to the system as a result of that, fix the problems, and get everybody up and running again. So the theory has been you want to avoid that event from occurring. You want to try to keep that event from occurring. The system has operated on a very thin margin for all of these reasons that we can get into in a broader discussion. And what those who operate the system have done was to carefully monitor the excess supply. And when it gets down to a point where there is no more than 1.5% margin above demand being supplied into the system, then they start this process of selectively turning off the juice to some customers, under the theory that if they control this introduction of new customers and new demand into the system, or taking people out of the system, they can avoid that kind of devastating crash of the system that I was referring to. There had been a process that was put in place in the late 70s and the early 80s in response to concerns about oil supply. At that time, oil was the primary fuel that was used in most of the power plants in California. Most of those plants have now been converted to natural gas. But when it became clear during the second OPEC crisis at the end of the 70s that there was a potential shortage of supply, the Commission realized it should put a process in place to selectively ramp back on consumption when it was necessary to do so. It set a process in place that identified certain customers that would be protected from those outages, basically police and fire stations, large hospitals, military bases, marine and air traffic control, radio and television stations that are part of an emergency broadcast network. They tried to find the people who had the most, and systems had the most impact, critical impact on health and safety, and exempt those people from the blackouts. You can't very effectively, as it turns out, exempt a particular building or a particular site from blackouts. You have to look for a circuit because they have to flip the switches on and off. And you wind up, when you black out a hospital, you wind up blacking out, or sorry, when you exempt a hospital from blackout, you wind up exempting every other user on that system. So you pick up a lot of residential customers and a lot of small businesses. Many of us are lucky. I live near a hospital, and I haven't had to experience a purposeful blackout. There have been others, but not the purposeful ones. And so the system stayed in place and was not used until we reached the crisis stage that we reached last winter, when there was a significant number of rolling blackouts. And as the process became used, it became clear that the old rules didn't cover all of the essential needs that need to be protected from blackouts. So the Commission went through a process, and if you want to, in the question and answer period, I can go through more of the details in terms of how that was done. But the Commission first revised its rules. It wound up adding other entities to the categorical exemptions. One of the clearest examples is hospitals. Before, you had to have 100 beds or more. So you had to go around and count the beds. So people were just putting lots of extra beds in the hallway. But then the Commission changed the rules and said, all right, we'll take all hospitals. It doesn't have to be a hospital of a certain size. The Commission changed the notification system so that residential customers who need electric support for life support and other purposes would get an early notification. Ordered the utilities to explore ways to exempt individuals without exempting a whole circuit. Set up a new process. This is one of my favorite bureaucratic terms of all times. They set up an optional, binding, mandatory curtailment program. And I'm just so proud of that. You know, you get in government, you try to create new and confusing terms. We did it this time. But what this basically says is that if there are customers on a system who want to work together to form a way that they can, on demand, cut their total demand of the system by 15% in a way that's measurable and provable, then the people on that circuit can be exempt from blackouts. And that process has been put in place. During January, the period of January to March, when people started experiencing these rolling blackouts, many customers asked for specific exemptions for their needs. And as has been mentioned, there's been a wide range of requests: ballparks, nursing facilities, health labs, organ donor labs, industrial manufacturing processes of various kinds, water and sewer districts, refineries. And the Commission undertook a very elaborate process, allowed for people to put in specific requests for exemptions. We received 10,000 or more requests. Consultants were hired to try to set up a scoring system and try to process all of these requests. The goal was to make sure that during summertime peak that there were at least 40% of the demand would be available for curtailment when that was necessary. The big utilities actually have been at closer to 50%, so there was a little bit of room for providing specific exemptions, and there were some additional exemptions that were granted by the Commission, and we can go into those details more later. Let's stop there and open things up for discussion so we can find out what's important to you too.
Questions? Well, let me toss one out. In your opinion, Eddie, what what should have been done in a perfect world by the legislature, the governor, the PUC? What, in your opinion, what could have changed things quicker?
Well, I guess to go all the way back, I think that retail competition at the time and in the way we did it was a mistake. So I would not have passed AB 1890 right out of the box. I think that was the biggest mistake. Divesting the generation from the utilities was done for good reason. The notion was that if your utilities owned all this generation and they were unregulated, they would have incredible market power. They would be able to set the price. But divesting them in a period of shortage, when there was no real understanding of how market power would work in this kind of a system, I think allowing that divestiture was a second huge mistake. And then going forward, the power exchange and the PUC, I hope, would have. This is a dicey question, but if you remember, what broke the back of the quote-unquote crisis was the governor entering into long-term contracts. So the issue there, I mean, the long-term contracts are too expensive. They cost too much. They are a high price for stability. But we should have had long-term contracts earlier. And there are a number of reasons that we could debate about why that didn't happen. But certainly that would have been a major help. After we got into free fall, I think the crisis mentality of throwing the state in as the purchaser in the way we did it had flaws because it wasn't thought through well enough, and I think that DWR was therefore in a position where they were buying too much too soon, which was also not helpful. And then, going forward from there, I think there was a huge, there still is, I believe, reluctance and timidity to examine the role of the holding companies in this whole thing. The holding company structure, which allowed what I'll refer to as the gangrenous utility to be hung out to dry, while billions of dollars were then uploaded into the holding companies, I think is a major policy issue that has never been really, we've never gotten to the root of. And attempts were made, and interestingly enough, while we can regulate and beat up on utilities a lot, as soon as we got near the holding company, things got shaky. People backed off. And PG&E ring-fenced assets. I mean, they went to the FERC and they said these are exempt. And they had a good argument that why should the holding company pay for this bankrupt policy that's creating wholesale prices that are higher than what we're getting back from customers. But that failed to recognize that in the initial 4 years of deregulation, prices were too high and billions of dollars were collected, which were then used to purchase stock and assets around the country and to strengthen the holding company stature, more so with PG&E than Edison. So there's 5 things, and we could go on. So I don't want to talk too much.
Steve, same question?
Well, yeah, I'm going to use a very high-tech visual here. You probably won't be able to see this in the back of the room at all, but I'll describe it for you. When I went to policy school, they taught us decision analysis. You build a tree, look at your options, see what's going to happen. Okay, so let's take the decision of whether or not you want to deregulate the generating component of electricity. When the time we started this discussion, the electric bill costs about 10 cents per kilowatt hour, just for sake of argument. And that large part of that is the cost of the distribution system and transmission system, as well as the cost of energy. The energy component was 3 cents. As you can see in the back clearly, there's the 3 cent right there. And so if you stay with business as usual, you got a 3 cent energy price and a 10 cent bundled kilowatt hour charge. Now the question is, why don't we see what the value would be of deregulating generation? Well, if you go down that path, you're going to get one of two outcomes. The optimistic outcome was that you could produce a very substantial savings on that 3 cents, that you could reduce that 3-cent figure fairly dramatically. But of course, that wouldn't affect the other 7 cents. That would still stay the same. So let's say, in the most optimistic scenario, you cut that 3 cents down to 2.5 cents. And instead of having a 10-cent rate, you've got a 9.5-cent rate. Now, to get to that point, you've got to be phenomenally optimistic about the way the market is going to function. All right, so the question is, what do you think are the odds that if you deregulate generation, that you're going to produce that result? Because you got to weight that number by the odds, right? Well, let's look at what the other potential outcome is. And that's actually something people would have giggled about, but turned out to be reality. Maybe that 3 cents turns into $5. Well, what happens if then? Well, then your 10-cent rate becomes a $5.07 rate. I added up kind of incorrectly here. And now you figure, what are the odds of that happening? Well, you could put a very low probability on that happening, and still it's a losing proposition. All right, where we are right now, we rolled the dice, we lost. It came out closer to the $5.07 option than it did to the 9.5-cent option. And I can think it's safe to say we are never, ever, in the course of history, going to make up that loss. In other words, we'll never get that 3-cent level down to 2.5 cents and collect enough extra half pennies to make up the difference. All right? So was it, at least with the benefit of hindsight, a bad proposition? It was an extremely bad proposition. Should we have seen that in advance? Yes. Why didn't we see it in advance? Well, I think the answer to that has to do with the fact that this was not an analysis-driven decision. None of these trees were ever made. Nobody talked about that $5 possibility. This was a philosophical decision. It was one that had to do with a fairly religious attachment to faith in the benefits of an open market. Probably a failure to acknowledge that the same people who brought what appeared to be a flawed regulatory structure into effect were going to have to set the rules for that market. There is really no such thing as a truly open market. And it was a failure to recognize that there were risks attached with what was going to be undertaken. That's important now because there's still really a discussion in California about where do you go from here, what lessons have we learned, and how do we adjust to the realities that we've experienced here. In the meantime, on the federal level, people are trucking along just like they did before, down the path toward the hoped-for 2.5-cent benefit, and or half-cent benefit. And the federal government is now undertaking proposed legislation that would give more powers to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and enable them to enforce the requirement to move toward competitive wholesale markets everywhere in the country. So the discussion's not over, and the lessons really haven't been learned yet. So I just want to add that on top of Nettie's good list.
And just to add a point to that, when we did it, we jumped off the cliff with the largest pilot project in the Western Hemisphere without any kind of, well, what do we have? What happens if it doesn't work? There was no safety net.
Yeah, if I can just add, because of course, safety net is the favorite word of people working in much of the nonprofit sector. We've been arguing since this crisis was defined that there should have been a larger consultation process. And as Steve pointed out, this was a philosophical decision. I'm not saying it would have come out better if more folks had been consulted, but it couldn't have come out worse. And I think that if there had been more bodies involved rather than a few politicians, a few economic analysts, and maybe a few engineers, I'm not sure, I may be misrepresenting it. I think there at least might have been some people who've would have asked the question, what if this doesn't work? What are the consequences of this for the public sector, both the investments that the public sector has in these private utilities and the work that needs to be done in order to keep government and keep non-governmental organizations that are serving human needs operating effectively. And those questions were never asked, and now here we are.
Ken, what do you see as the continued impact on nonprofits who have such a tight budget to begin with and really cannot absorb unanticipated additional expenses?
Yeah. Obviously, it means that they're going to have to, if their expenses are increasing, they've got to go elsewhere to increase their revenue, and that's very difficult right now with the declining economy. Foundations are going to be losing part of the income that they were counting on from the stock market. Local government is suffering because of a lack of tourism and transient occupancy tax. So it creates a very difficult situation. There's a combination of factors now. The terrorist attacks and the energy crisis are really combining to put a lot of stress on nonprofits. Nonprofit workers tend to work at a sort of substandard wage, and I think once the economy gets better, if things don't get better for nonprofits, we saw a little bit of a brain drain from nonprofits during the boom period, and people moving from nonprofit public sector work into private entrepreneurial work because the opportunities and the income were so much better there. I can see burnout on the part of both board and staff members, and a possible decline in both the quality of service and the quantity of service. It's very fluid right now, and we're trying to work with the governor's office and with the legislature so that the nonprofits have more of a seat at the table as we go further down the line. As I mentioned, we have anticipating some reductions in the state budget this year, and probably further reductions in the following year. So I'm really just advocating for consultation now. I don't know what solutions we'll come up with.
Questions? Please.
Like Steve underlining Nettie's every word, I underline every word that all of you have spoken. But at the risk of venturing into this dangerous philosophical or religious or political realm, and not the analysis realm, would the panel care to comment on the scenario for the public benefit if there had been tight campaign finance laws in place, and if campaign finance money had not been played out, would that have really made a fundamental difference? And secondly, on the very negative side, if PG&E goes bankrupt and Southern Cal Edison, is that really so bad for the commonweal of the state of California? I would love to have comments on those 2 points. Campaign finance and bankruptcy of the private
Nettie?
utilities.
Well, I've worked on campaign finance a lot of.
People hear the question in the back? No. Maybe could repeat the question.
Do you want me?
Would you?
What he asked was, would we comment on the impact of campaign finance or lack of campaign finance reformation, and the larger impact of the, would it be so bad if the utilities went bankrupt? 2 questions, right? On the first one, I spent a long time in my life working on campaign reform, campaign finance reform, and I feel very, very dearly about it. I have no question that the combination of campaign finance law and term limits has dealt a terrible blow to the quality of our legislature. Having said that, and there are tons of reasons why the votes on AB 1890 were impacted by campaign contribution, but you have to know that this was hatched at the Public Utilities Commission. The deregulation plan came to the legislature almost whole clock, almost fully done. So there was this problem. There was a real huge momentum that was created where the legislature thought, well, how bad can it be? The PUC, who's got the expertise, has already come down this road. Now, you'd have to trace back to the PUC commissioners and what impact campaign contributions had on who they were, and why, for some unknown reason, in the decade previous to this one, or the 2 decades, we had this unbelievable religious fanaticism about markets and deregulation. It's true that was the problem, but it's a longer story than just who was in office and who was taking money during the AB 1890 vote. And in terms of the utilities going bankrupt, there's arguments that maybe it wouldn't be so bad, and I've been trying to be someone who all through this discussion has been what I called a sort of neutral or agnostic on the issue, so that we could make the policy determinations without just this fanaticism about rescuing a corporation. But having seen the PG&E proposal and understanding how much things are fluid now, I think that there are some very, very serious ramifications to the bankruptcies, both for those folks who are investors in the utility and for the future of regulation and the future of our ability to have control over essential assets. Comment?
Yeah, if I can comment on both parts of that question. First, there's no doubt in my mind that the entire electric restructuring process was driven by certain entities that thought they had something to gain. I mean, it was largely a process that was driven by the largest commercial industrial consumers who thought that if they were given the freedom to choose another supplier, that they could probably skim the cream off the top, get the lowest price power that was available. And it was driven by a bunch of private companies that wanted to get in the business of owning generation, and I think to some extent by the utilities, who had identified that while their regulated entity had a sort of a fixed return on its investment of maybe 10 or 12%, that if they had an unregulated entity that was in the utility business or in the power business, it could be making much larger returns on its investment. Those entities obviously are the entities that have the ability to spend money in terms of investing in campaigns. And I think it's clearly the case that both in terms of the way the PUC functioned in the middle 90s and the way the legislatures functioned during that period and continue to operate now, that they're heavily affected by their economic relationships to those entities. At the same time, even if you had campaign finance reform, I think you'd also have to have lobbying reform, because if you strip back the direct economic trigger, you still have some fairly deeply endowed enterprises that can afford to have experts, to have those people meeting with the commissioners at the PUC, spending a tremendous amount of time at the legislature, and they're the voices that are heard the most often. If you want to change the dialogue, you have to get to that process as well. And in terms of bankruptcy, this has been an educational process for all of us. I think that it's a broader debate about whether it's better to let utilities go bankrupt or not let them go bankrupt. But there are a couple of reasons that one might not want to let them go bankrupt. One is, as we're seeing in the effort that PG&E is currently undertaking at the federal bankruptcy court, there can be an effort to undermine the processes that provide oversight and control of those utilities on a forward-looking basis. Put more simply, the utilities can find a way to use bankruptcy to potentially get out of being regulated. And that's a very serious issue, because I think that if anything has been proven in the last couple of years, that there's a need for direct regulatory oversight over this very vital commodity and the way it's delivered and the price that's charged for it. But the other factor is that if one believes, as I think some of the commissioners at the PUC certainly do right now, that the best way to start fixing the problem is to have the utilities resume their obligation to serve and resume their obligation to plan for adequate resources on a going forward basis, there's a very strong argument that you need to have financially healthy utilities in order to do that. A company that's tied up in bankruptcy in many ways is not a financially healthy company.
Questions? Yes, the back.
Could you comment a little more on just natural gas regulation 101 or the lack thereof? And Nettie talked about the media fixation being on keeping the lights on, and that's what everybody's giving their attention to. But natural gas prices were skyrocketing and having an adverse impact on low-income people, especially. Our dependency on natural gas as a fuel for new power plants and that sort of thing.
Sure. And I hope Steve has a lot more expertise in natural gas than I do. Natural gas was deregulated. The commodity was deregulated 10 years before electricity.
We can't hear you.
Let me try again. Well, these don't seem to work, or do they? Does that help?
To the camera.
Oh, okay, let me try and project. to hear? I wonder if this helps. I was saying, I hope Steve takes on this because he knows more about natural gas than I do. The commodity of natural gas for us, for retail customers, was deregulated some time ago, but the utility would purchase natural gas on behalf of us and pass through the exact price. There was no markup. I'm simplifying, of course, but what occurred, at least what seems to have occurred last winter, is in addition to a supply shortage for certain reasons, there was also a curtailment of transportation. And while we saw natural gas prices go up all over the country, we saw a huge increase at the California border. And some of the best thinking indicates that the pipeline capacity from the Southwest was manipulated through market control so that there wasn't enough available capacity to get the gas to us without huge markups. So we were seeing a pass-through of a wholesale cost that the utilities were paying for natural gas during the winter. There were changes in the capacity on the pipelines, and there was also additional supply that came into the market. I mean, the Canadian fields started drilling after the winter, and the Southwest started producing more gas. So those two facts have brought the price down. I think that 100% dependence on natural gas as a supply for electricity is a huge mistake. We saw the prices in the electric side were not unrelated to the gas because gas was manufacturing electricity. So those natural gas prices were passed on in the electricity prices. And that's all that is on the drawing boards for the future is 100% development of natural gas. I mean, we are trying really hard to get some renewable policy in place, but we know from history that there's no sense in putting all our eggs in one basket. We will suffer financial consequences for doing that.
Yeah, Nettie did a great job. They're fundamentally, if we're getting down to gas 101, I mean, they're really fundamentally three qualities that affect gas supply and service. Do you have to find a place to get it? You got to move it into the area where you need it. And then in order to make sure that there's a smooth supply, because there's a higher demand sometimes than during others, you got to store it somewhere. That's one of the benefits of gas over electricity. You can actually put it in a well and store it. What happened last year is we had all three of those factors line up together to hurt us. There wasn't as much being supplied because the price for gas at the wellhead, where they draw the gas up, was fairly low in comparison to historical prices. The producers weren't motivated to bring the gas up out of the ground. Most of the gas California uses comes from out of state. There are gas resources here. They tend to largely not be of the quality that people like to use for processes like generating electricity. And so there's a tremendous need to bring gas from the Southwest and from Canada and bring it down into the state. So there wasn't as much being produced, so the price at the fields went up slightly. Then there was a transportation problem up to the California border, which Nettie has already talked about. The specific problem had to do with one entity controlling too much of the access on the pipeline into Southern California, and that had a very dramatic impact on the price of transmitting the gas. Gas transmission used to be a small component of the price of gas. It became a very large component. And the third factor is, for a series of reasons, the amount of gas that was being stored within the state had gone down, so that when we got to the high demand level last winter, the utilities didn't have the ability to draw on those gas resources within the state as much as they usually did. They had to pay a huge price to get gas in at the California border for both the reasons that I talked about. And there was just a historically dramatic increase in the price of gas. The gas prices have been so low historically over the last decade or so that the Commission had agreed with the utilities at one point in the past to, in effect, allow the utilities to change their gas rates on a month-to-month basis based on the price that they're facing for gas. That's very different than electricity, where the rates have been locked into place pretty much since 1996. So that when the utilities started facing high gas prices, they immediately started raising their rates. And so you had some very, very serious problems resulting from that. We have the luxury in this area of having fairly temperate weather in the winter. It's not necessarily so for people on fixed incomes who've moved to the high desert, for instance, in Southern California, and faced bills that were so high they were wondering whether they could maintain their households. Things have improved on all fronts. The response to the high prices caused the producers to bring more gas out of the ground. The constraint on the pipeline to the California border has largely been removed because the entity that was controlling that resource no longer controls it. And the storage in California now is historically high. There's been an effort to draw as much gas as possible into the state when the demand was low and to inject it into those storage wells. The downside of that is that stored gas was bought at a very high price because people started buying it during the time when the prices were still high through the winter and into the spring. In terms of dependence on gas as a fuel in this state, we're getting more and more dependent on gas every day, and this is I think, a very critical long-term issue. There's good news and bad news about all the new natural gas power plants that are being built in the state. The good news is that the technology now is much, much more efficient than the technology that applied to the old utility plants that were sold to these competitive generators and have been supplying power to the state. As those new plants come online, their consumption per kilowatt hour is going to go down very, very dramatically. Air quality is going to be improved as those new plants bump the old plants out of the market. That's the good news. The bad news is that eventually you're going to reach an equilibrium point and you're going to start just needing more and more gas for power plants. Power plants are basically the largest consumers of natural gas, and so they're going to have a huge impact on the need for more supplies in the state and for the need for more infrastructure, more pipelines. But as we've learned with oil, dependence on a single fuel is a very, very mistaken endeavor, and the state realizes that. It's created a new power authority to have that authority invest in new generating resources that the state will own and control. And the legislature has designated $1 billion initially for the Power Authority to invest in renewable resources. The PUC has set in place incentive programs for distributed renewable resources. These are all efforts to try to gradually, at least, move the state off of its dependence on natural gas. You're not likely to see coal plants in California. I still don't think you're likely to see new nuclear plants. So it's really renewables that are going to be needed to make up the difference and break up our growing overdependence on natural gas. So that's the quick version.
Yes. Yes.
In response to the electricity crisis, one of the most almost instantaneous responses was the rapid buildup or plan to build up new power plants in the state, primarily natural gas. And I understand that in the years of the planning of deregulation bill and the years following it, not many plants were built in that time, and that there was a need for perhaps some more to be built with the lack of them being built at that time in the electricity crisis. But I have a concern about this being a bit too much reactionary to a bit of the hype of the electricity crisis, people's perceived risks, and I'm concerned about what the impact and the implications will be on a lot of low-income and minority communities, which will have to face a lot of these newly built plants in their communities, in their areas. And I was wondering what all of you, your perspective maybe on this.
So your question primarily goes to the environmental impacts on low-income people as opposed to cost?
Do you also share this idea that perhaps it's too quick of a build-up, we're not taking enough time to really consider what the needs are, where it needs to be built, what type of plant, whether we do need all these new natural gas plants, or as you folks have been discussing for the past 10-15 minutes, that perhaps we can diversify and not rely solely on natural gas plants, but invest in renewables, invest in other alternatives.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
You can get to the human side. Let me try to lay some of the structure.
That's important.
Okay, I think that what happened when we had integrated utilities is that the utilities we could require that the utilities go through an integrated resource planning process, and look at all available resources, anticipate future demand, and build in a rational way. That central control was lost when we restructured the markets. The hope was that the markets would take care of these things on their own. There's certainly one built-in danger that we've seen demonstrated in the last year or so, which is that the process goes in fits and starts, and it's awkward. So you get the high price response, and then people say, wow, the prices are high, we ought to build more resources. Then they look around for investors, and they look around for places to do it, and then they go through the regulatory process, and 4 or 5 years later, they've got a power plant in place. And then they look around and say, okay, here we are, and meanwhile, because the prices were so high, demand went down, and then you got excess capacity. And then you're going to go into, my fear is that you're going to go through that same process over and over again if we stay within the structure, where it may take 5 years, it may take 2 years, it may take 20, but we'd see the same phenomenon again, where there'd be a dramatic increase in price, people would have to hunker down, and then slowly there will be a response with more generating resources. There has largely been enough in terms of electric supply in the region, in the state and within the western region, to meet demand during the last 2 years. What there has not been has been sufficient supply to allow the marketplace to provide stable resources and allow the marketplace to keep the price down. So the strategy becomes build as much excess as people are willing to build, because the more you build, the more stable supply is, and the lower the price is going to be. And the question is this a rational way to plan? Well, I think it's implied by the way I'm asking the question. I think it's a terrible way to plan. But that's where we are right now. And then the question is, what are the human impacts of that? And I think Ken wanted to address that.
Well, actually, I want to follow up on what you're saying, because I think the comparative analysis has not been done. And for example, solar energy sounds really wonderful, but solar energy takes up a lot of space if you use open land for it. And so there's places where the economic and in the environmental issues in terms of low income and minority people combine. So if you take a lot of land out of use for residential purposes or business purposes, you may drive up the cost of land in a way that is detrimental to the low-income person. So, I think we need to do more of a cost-benefits analysis that's both environmental and economic. I don't have any answers, but I just feel that, as I've said over and over again, the consultation process and the policy-driven rather than politically-driven approach we're far from that, and we need to move closer to it.
Yes.
For comparative analysis, which states are your organizations looking at, either domestically or abroad, as a model of where energy seems to work?
Natty, do you have any thoughts?
I think that's a hard question, because, if you look at the basic two models are regulation versus market, and there are people who will argue that there are better or worse markets, and I think that's true, but I believe that if we looked around during the last winter, the places where prices were the most fair and the most stable were public power, LADWP, Sacramento Mud. So I guess if I'm asked that question, I think that I would look towards public control of the assets that are essential for the well-being of the public. And so the best place to look would be in California at the best munis. And in other, I'm not an expert on the comparative states or national either. A lot of work is being done around the world to try and move towards deregulation. I don't know how many of you followed Brazil this winter, but it was an amazing story. It made our energy crisis look benign. And their legislature was debating whether or not they would go to a deregulated market, more deregulated market, in order to fix the problem. And you had the World Bank exerting pressure to say that if you don't privatize, you're not going to get loan forgiveness and aid. So, my personal opinion is that the rhetoric and the ideology of the free market goes very, very, very deeply into the issue. I don't think that Brazil was in a position to have the resources to create the public system that we might envision. But there's been, people have been looking at New Zealand also, and there's been some very serious problems with the notion of a market. I mean, I think markets are great, don't get me wrong, but I'd rather have, if I was going to have a supply and demand curve that where the economic indications suggesting more supply were trailing so that we'd have curves, I'd rather have it in Q-tips than in essential commodities. And also because electricity requires such an amazing initial investment to build electricity power plants, the lag time is going to be greater. So that speaks for, a centralized resource planning model. So I think I would look towards improving public power.
I think it's a superb question, and I think you could look at other places in the country and in the world where there are particular elements of the market rules that are better than the elements that we have in California. I can use the example of the fact that in California, when the wholesale markets were first established, there was not any check and balance on the relationship between the cost a particular generator was facing and the price they bid into the market. If you go to New York, for instance, you'd find that there's a market monitoring committee that looks at those prices, and when they seem out of whack with cost, they've got some ability to leverage down the prices. That's a hopeful type of improvement in the rules, and you can look for things like that. But as Nettie says, the fundamental question is whether the market model is going to drive you where you want to go. It's very dangerous to look at any of the existing competitive wholesale markets in the country and reach any conclusions. California had the right combination of ingredients that occurred at the outset of its restructuring process to demonstrate the flaws right away. Others didn't have the right set of ingredients, or were luckier. You take something like the PJM model, which is Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland. People say, look at PJM, it's working beautifully, the prices have gone up. Yeah, maybe there aren't that many people who are choosing to go to a different provider, but the prices haven't skyrocketed the way they have in California. Well, Pennsylvania started out with a very large reserve margin, a lot of excess generation. And so that is an enormously big factor in terms of the way people are bidding their resources into the market. The question is PJM going to look as successful once that margin begins to dip? And we just have to wait around a few years to find out. But it's way too early to point to another model and say this one works.
Okay, with that, I think we're out of time. Steve, Ken, Nettie, thank you.
If there's anybody here from Southern California, I'd like to invite you to a meeting that we're co-sponsoring.
You're watching the California Channel, brought to you as a public service by California's cable television industry.